Welcome to Untold Tales, where the shadows of the unknown come to life. I'm thrilled to have you with us today as we embark on a journey into the heart of darkness, where three friends are drawn into a world of ancient secrets and supernatural horrors. Together, they will face the unimaginable, unlocking the mysteries of a malevolent force that threatens to consume everything. So without further ado, let's begin the story. Chapter 1: An Invitation to Darkness. The dull hum of the air conditioner was the only sound that broke the silence in Dr. Emily Harrison's small but meticulously organized study. The room, tucked away in the corner of her Victorian-style home, was a sanctuary of sorts, an escape from the noise of the world outside. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with ancient texts, historical maps, and the occasional oddity she had collected during her travels. A heavy mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with a mixture of old parchment, half-filled notebooks, and the glowing screen of her laptop. Emily sat hunched over a dusty tome, the yellowed pages filled with the forgotten history of a small town that had long since vanished from most maps. The town was Black Hollow, a place that had piqued her interest ever since she had stumbled upon a cryptic reference to it in a rare book she had purchased at a flea market years ago. According to the text, Black Hollow was a thriving community in the early 1900s, but in 1924 it became the site of a mysterious tragedy that wiped out most of its population overnight. No one knew what had happened, at least no one who had survived. For years, Emily had researched the town, piecing together fragments of its history. Yet despite her best efforts, the details of that fateful night in 1924 eluded her. The town's archives were lost, and the few surviving records were vague, as if someone or something had intentionally erased its history. As she flipped through the brittle pages, a soft chime from her laptop pulled her attention away. A new email had arrived. She leaned back in her chair, her curiosity piqued. It was unusual for her to receive messages at this hour. Most of her colleagues knew better than to disturb her during her late-night research sessions. The subject line of the email was simple but intriguing: an invitation to darkness. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the mouse. Something about the email felt off, but her curiosity won out and she clicked on it. The message was short and to the point. Dr. Harrison, if you truly wish to understand the mystery of Black Hollow, you must come to the town itself. There is much that you do not know, much that you have not yet uncovered. The truth lies within the shadows, and it is waiting for you. But be warned, the darkness that took the town still lingers. I will meet you at the Old Sturch at midnight on the 30th of this month. Do not be late. There was no signature, no name, only the cryptic message. Emily stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could have sent this? How did they know about her research on Black Hollow? And why now? She read the message again, her mind racing. It was already the 28th of the month, leaving her only 2 days to prepare. The rational part of her mind told her to ignore the message. It was likely a prank, a cruel joke by someone who had stumbled upon her work. But another part of her, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, urged her to go. This could be the breakthrough she had been waiting for. After a moment of deliberation, she made up her mind. She would go to Black Hollow. She had to know the truth. 2 days later, the early morning sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon when Emily packed her things into the trunk of her car. She had spent the last 48 hours in a frenzy of preparation, gathering everything she thought she might need for the trip. Her laptop, several notebooks, a high-powered flashlight, and a small tape recorder were among the essentials. She also packed a few personal items, a locket that had belonged to her mother, a small silver cross, and a leather-bound journal where she recorded her most private thoughts. The journey to Black Hollow was not a short one. The town was located deep in the New England countryside, far from the bustling city where Emily lived. It was a place few had heard of, and even fewer had visited. The roads that led there were winding and treacherous, cutting through dense forests and over steep hills. It was the kind of place that the world seemed to have forgotten. As she drove, the landscape around her gradually changed. The tall buildings of the city gave way to sprawling fields and small towns, and then to thick forests that seemed to swallow the road. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out much of the sunlight. The further she went, the more isolated she felt, as if she were driving into another world entirely. It was late afternoon by the time she finally saw the sign, "Welcome to Black Hollow, population 0." The sign was old and weathered, the paint peeling off in places. It was clear that no one had taken care of it in years. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine. There was something unsettling about seeing a population of 0, an eerie reminder that she was entering a ghost town. She drove through the town's main street, which was little more than a dirt road lined with dilapidated buildings. Most of the windows were boarded up, and the few that weren't were broken, their glass shattered and scattered on the ground. Weeds and wildflowers had taken over the sidewalks, growing unchecked in the cracks and crevices. The air was thick with the scent of decay and neglect. Emily parked her car in front of what had once been the town's general store. The building was barely standing, its roof sagging in the middle and its walls covered in ivy. She got out of the car and stood for a moment, taking in her surroundings. The town was deathly quiet, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. There was no turning back now. The sun was setting by the time she found the old stone church. It was on the outskirts of town, set back from the road and partially hidden by the surrounding trees. The church was a stark contrast to the rest of the town. While it was old and weathered, it still stood tall and imposing, its stone walls covered in moss and ivy. The windows were stained glass, though many were cracked or missing entirely. She approached the heavy wooden doors, her footsteps echoing on the stone pathway. The air around the church felt different, thicker, colder, as if the building itself was alive. She reached for the handle, hesitating for just a moment before pulling the door open. The interior of the church was dark, the only light coming from the few remaining stained glass windows. The pews were covered in dust, and cobwebs hung from the rafters. At the front of the church, the altar stood silent and empty, a thick layer of dust covering its surface. Emily stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a presence, though she couldn't see anyone. The air was heavy, with an oppressive silence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She walked down the center aisle, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. When she reached the front of the church, she stopped, turning slowly to survey the room. She saw nothing but shadows and dust, yet she felt as though she was being watched. Then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. "You came." Emily spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure emerged from the shadows behind the altar. It was a man, tall and thin, his face partially obscured by the darkness. He wore a long, dark coat, and his eyes glinted in the dim light. "Who are you?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling slightly. The man stepped forward, his face becoming clearer. He was older, with sharp features and a thin, almost skeletal frame. His eyes were cold and calculating, yet there was something else in them, something dark and dangerous. "My name is not important," the man replied, his voice low and smooth. "What matters is why you are here." "I received your message," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You said you could tell me the truth about Black Hollow." The man nodded slowly. "Yes, the truth. But be warned, Dr. Harrison, the truth is not what you think. This town is cursed, and the darkness that took it has never truly left. If you wish to uncover its secrets, you must be prepared to face the consequences." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about the man, something that made her instinctively wary. But she had come this far, and she wasn't about to turn back now. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Very well," he said, "then let us begin." As the man began to speak, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. His voice echoed off the stone walls, filling the church with a haunting, almost otherworldly sound. He told her about the town's history, about the mysterious event in 1924 that had led to its downfall. But he also spoke of something darker, something ancient and malevolent that had taken root in Black Hollow long before the town was even founded. Emily listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. The more the man spoke, the more she realized that this was no ordinary curse. The darkness that had claimed Black Hollow was something far more sinister, something that had been lying in wait for centuries, feeding off the fear and despair of those who had lived and died in the town. And now, it seemed, it had turned its attention to her. By the time the man finished speaking, the church was completely dark, the last rays of sunlight having disappeared behind the horizon. Emily felt a sense of dread settle over her, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. "There is no turning back now, Dr. Harrison," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The darkness knows you are here, and it will not rest until it has claimed you." Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had come to Black Hollow seeking answers, but now she wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. But it was too late. She was already in too deep. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. The man stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "You must find the source of the darkness," he said. "It is hidden deep within the town, buried beneath layers of lies and deception. But be warned, once you start down this path, there is no going back. The darkness will do everything in its power to stop you." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. Whatever it took, she would uncover the truth about Black Hollow, no matter the cost. "Where do I start?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. The man's eyes gleamed in the darkness. "Follow the whispers, Dr. Harrison," he said. "They will lead you to the truth." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Emily alone in the dark, empty church. As she stood there, the weight of his words settled over her. The whispers of the forgotten, those who had been claimed by the darkness, were all around her, just beyond the edge of hearing. They beckoned to her, calling her deeper into the heart of Black Hollow, where the truth lay hidden. And Emily knew that there was no turning back now. The darkness had claimed her, and there was no escape. Chapter 2. The Town of Echoes. The morning light filtered weakly through the thick canopy of trees surrounding Black Hollow, casting long, eerie shadows over the abandoned town. As Emily Harrison stepped out of the old stone church, the chill in the air was palpable. More than just the early autumn cold, it felt as though the very atmosphere of the town was alive, pressing down on her with an invisible weight. Her thoughts were a swirling tempest of questions and unease. The man she had met in the church had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving her with only cryptic instructions and a growing sense of dread. The memory of his cold, piercing eyes lingered in her mind, along with the unsettling realization that whatever darkness had consumed Black Hollow, it now had its sights set on her. Emily's footsteps echoed softly on the cracked cobblestones as she made her way back to the main street. The town was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made her acutely aware of her own breathing, her own heartbeat. The buildings that lined the street were little more than decaying husks, their windows shattered or boarded up, their walls covered in creeping ivy and moss. The remnants of once thriving businesses now stood as silent witnesses to the town's mysterious downfall. She paused in front of what had once been the general store, its weathered sign barely legible through the layers of grime and decay. The door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. For a moment, she considered going inside, but something held her back. An inexplicable sense of foreboding, as if the store itself was warning her to stay away. Instead, she continued down the street, her eyes scanning the buildings for any sign of life. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound, not even the distant call of a bird or the rustling of leaves. It was as if the town had been frozen in time, suspended in a perpetual state of decay and abandonment. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see the figure of the man from the church following her. But each time she turned, there was nothing. Only the empty street and the oppressive silence. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the end of the main street, where the buildings gave way to overgrown fields and dense woods. A narrow path led off into the trees, its entrance partially obscured by tall weeds and underbrush. A weathered signpost stood beside the path, its faded letters barely readable. Cemetery Hill. Emily hesitated, the sense of unease growing stronger. The man's words echoed in her mind. Follow the whispers. They will lead you to the truth. She had no idea what he meant by whispers, but the path to Cemetery Hill seemed as good a place to start as any. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the path, pushing through the overgrown weeds and branches that clawed at her clothes. The air grew cooler as she entered the forest, the trees closing in around her like silent sentinels. The only sound was the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath her feet, each step seeming to echo in the unnatural stillness. As she walked, a faint sound reached her ears, so faint she wasn't sure if she was imagining it. It was a whisper, barely audible, carried on the breeze that wound through the trees. Emily stopped, straining to hear, but the whisper faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves in its wake. She continued on, her senses heightened, every nerve on edge. The path twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches interlocking above her, blocking out the sunlight. The further she went, the darker it became, until the path was little more than a shadowy tunnel through the woods. The whisper came again, louder this time, more distinct. Emily stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something unsettling about it, a dissonant note that set her on edge. She turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but the whisper seemed to come from all around her, echoing through the trees. It was a woman's voice, she realized, though the words were still too faint to make out. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the whisper, growing fainter now, as if retreating into the depths of the forest. Emily hesitated, uncertainty gnawing at her. This was madness, following disembodied whispers into the dark woods of a cursed town. But the man's warning rang in her ears. The darkness will do everything in its power to stop you. Steeling herself, she pressed on, following the path as it wound deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, their gnarled roots snaking across the ground, threatening to trip her with every step. The whisper was her only guide, a faint, ghostly sound that seemed to pull her forward, deeper into the darkness. After what felt like hours, the path finally began to widen, the trees thinning out as she approached the base of a steep hill. At the top of the hill, silhouetted against the darkening sky, stood a small, decrepit building, an old chapel, its steeple leaning precariously to one side. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she stared up at the chapel. The air around it was thick with an oppressive, almost tangible darkness, as the very ground was tainted by the curse that had claimed the town. The whisper had led her here, she realized, to this place where the dead were buried. Taking a deep breath, she began the climb up the hill, her footsteps slow and cautious. The ground was uneven, the soil loose and treacherous beneath her feet. As she neared the top, the whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear, an endless litany of words she couldn't quite understand. When she reached the top, she found herself standing before the chapel's entrance, its wooden doors hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. The building was in even worse condition up close, its walls cracked and crumbling, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The windows were little more than gaping holes, the stained glass long since shattered. But it wasn't the chapel that held her attention, it was the cemetery beyond it. The graveyard was small, enclosed by a wrought iron fence that was barely standing, its bars twisted and broken in places. The gravestones were old and weathered, many of them tilted or toppled over, their inscriptions worn away by time. Weeds and wildflowers grew unchecked among the graves, their roots intertwining with the bones of the dead. And there, at the center of the cemetery, was a single grave that stood out from the rest. It was a large, ornate tomb, its surface covered in intricate carvings that depicted scenes of mourning and death. The stone was dark, almost black, and unlike the other graves, it was untouched by the passage of time. The name on the tomb was still clearly visible, etched deeply into the stone, Amelia Hawthorne. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read the name. Amelia Hawthorne, the name was familiar, but she couldn't place where she had heard it before. She stepped closer, her eyes drawn to the carvings that adorned the tomb. They were strange, unsettling, a mixture of religious imagery and something far darker, symbols that seemed to twist and writhe as she looked at them. The whisper grew louder, more urgent, as if trying to tell her something. She reached out to touch the tomb, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. The moment her skin made contact, the whisper stopped. Silence fell over the cemetery, the air heavy and still. Emily's heart raced as she waited, expecting something, anything, to happen. But there was nothing, only the oppressive silence and the weight of the darkness pressing down on her. She pulled her hand back, her fingers tingling from the cold of the stone. The name on the tomb stared back at her, the letters seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. Amelia Hawthorne. Who was she? And why did her grave seem to be the focal point of whatever malevolent force haunted Black Hollow? Emily turned, her eyes scanning the cemetery for any sign of movement, but the graves remained silent and still. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than before, as if the very ground beneath her was alive with the presence of the dead. She knew she couldn't stay here, couldn't linger in this place of death and darkness. But she also knew that the answers she sought lay buried here, in the forgotten history of Black Hollow and the secrets of Amelia Hawthorne's tomb. As she turned to leave, she noticed something, a faint glow coming from the base of the tomb. It was almost imperceptible, a soft, eerie light that seemed to pulse faintly, as if beckoning her closer. Against her better judgment, Emily knelt beside the tomb, her fingers brushing away the dirt and debris that had gathered at its base. There, hidden among the weeds and roots, she found a small metal object embedded in the ground. It was a key. The key was old, its surface tarnished and worn, but as she held it in her hand, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if the key had been waiting for her. There was something written on the key, barely visible in the fading light. She held it closer, squinting to make out the letters. Amelia's Rest. Emily's mind raced. What was this key for? And what was Amelia's Rest? Was it a place or something else entirely? She pocketed the key, her mind made up. Whatever Amelia's Rest was, she would find it. She had come to Black Hollow seeking answers, and now she was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. But as she turned to leave the cemetery, the whisper returned, more insistent than ever, and this time she could finally make out the words, "Beware the blood moon, for it heralds the return of the Dark One." A chill ran down Emily's spine as the whisper faded into the night. She didn't know what the words meant, but she had a feeling she would find out soon enough. With one last glance at the tomb of Amelia Hawthorne, Emily turned and made her way back down the hill, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The darkness of Black Hollow was closing in around her, and the deeper she went, the more she realized that there was no turning back. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Shadows. The journey back to the old stone church felt longer than Emily remembered. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows that stretched across the path like the fingers of a lurking phantom. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent her heart racing, as if the forest itself was alive with malevolent intent. The whispering voices had faded, but their eerie echo still lingered in her mind, each word a haunting reminder of the darkness that gripped Black Hollow. The cryptic message about the blood moon gnawed at her thoughts, and she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Clutching the old key she had found at Amelia Hawthorne's tomb, Emily quickened her pace, eager to return to the relative safety of the church. The man she had met earlier, the mysterious figure who seemed to know more than he let on, might still be there, and she needed answers. There was something about the way he had spoken, the way he had looked at her, that suggested he knew the true nature of the evil lurking in Black Hollow. As she emerged from the forest and stepped back onto the cracked cobblestone of the town, a sense of unease washed over her. The town was just as silent and lifeless as before. But there was something different in the air, an almost imperceptible shift, as if the shadows were deeper, the darkness more oppressive. Emily hurried down the main street, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The old stone church loomed ahead, its dark silhouette a stark contrast against the pale gray sky. The broken windows stared back at her like empty eye sockets, and the crumbling stone walls seemed to lean inwards, as if the building itself was collapsing under the weight of its own secrets. She hesitated at the entrance, her hand hovering over the rusted iron handle. A part of her wanted to turn back, to leave Black Hollow and never look back. But she knew she couldn't. Something had drawn her here, and until she uncovered the truth, she couldn't leave. Taking a deep breath, Emily pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The interior of the church was just as she had left it, dark, cold, and filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. The pews were covered in dust, the altar draped in a faded black cloth, and the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. She scanned the room, searching for any sign of the man, but the church appeared empty. The only light came from the broken windows, casting thin beams of pale sunlight across the floor, illuminating the floating dust motes like tiny, shimmering specters. "Hello?" Emily called out, her voice trembling slightly in the silence. There was no response, only the echo of her own voice, bouncing off the stone walls. She took a few tentative steps forward, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath her feet. As she approached the altar, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small leather-bound book lying on the floor, partially hidden beneath the pews. It looked out of place in the otherwise desolate church, as if someone had left it there intentionally. Curiosity piqued, Emily knelt down and picked up the book. The leather was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. The cover bore no title, only a strange symbol, a crescent moon surrounded by what looked like rays of light, or perhaps flames. She opened the book, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the brittle pages. The writing inside was faded and difficult to read, the ink smudged and blurred in places. But as she skimmed through the pages, she began to realize that this was no ordinary book. It was a journal, filled with entries written by someone who had lived in Black Hollow long ago. The first few entries were mundane, detailing the daily life of the town's inhabitants, their struggles, their joys, their fears. But as Emily read further, the tone of the journal began to change, growing darker, more frantic. Entry dated October 13th, 1886. The townspeople are on edge. Strange things have been happening. Disappearances, mysterious illnesses, and sightings of ghostly figures in the woods. The elders say it is a curse, a punishment for our sins. But I do not believe in curses. I believe in something far worse. There is a darkness in this town, something ancient and malevolent. I fear it has awoken, and it is hungry. Entry dated October 20th, 1886. Another child went missing today, a little girl named Sarah. Her mother swears she saw her wandering into the woods following a strange light. The search parties found nothing, only her doll lying at the edge of the forest, soaked in blood. The whispers have returned, growing louder each night. They say the Dark One is coming, and the blood moon will be his herald. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she read the last entry, the words echoing the warning she had heard in the cemetery. She turned the page, eager to learn more, but the next entry had been violently scratched out, the words obscured by deep, angry gouges in the paper. She flipped through the remaining pages, but the rest of the journal was blank, as if the writer had suddenly stopped, or perhaps something had stopped them. A sense of urgency gripped Emily as she closed the journal, her mind racing. The journal confirmed her worst fears. Whatever darkness had claimed Black Hollow had been growing for decades, maybe even longer. And now, with the blood moon approaching, it was preparing to strike again. But what was this Dark One? And what did the whispers mean by Amelia's rest? The name echoed in her mind, its significance tantalizingly out of reach. She was about to pocket the journal when a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, shuffling noise coming from the back of the church. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was clear that someone, or something, was moving towards her. Slowly, she turned around, her eyes scanning the darkened church. At first, she saw nothing, only the empty pews and the shadows that filled the corners of the room. But then, from the far end of the aisle, a figure began to emerge from the darkness. It was the man from before, the mysterious figure she had encountered in the church. But something was different about him now. His movements were slow and deliberate, his posture stiff and unnatural. His face was hidden in shadow, but as he drew closer, Emily could see that his eyes were glowing with a faint, eerie light. She took a step back, her heart racing. The man stopped in front of her, his glowing eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with tension. Finally, the man broke the silence, his voice low and hollow. "You found the journal?" Emily nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "What is this place? What happened here?" The man's expression remained unreadable, his eyes still glowing with that unnatural light. "Black Hollow is a place of secrets," he said slowly. "Secrets that should never have been uncovered. The darkness that haunts this town is older than you can imagine, older than the town itself." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "The Dark One," the man continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was here long before the town was built, long before the first settlers arrived. He was imprisoned, sealed away by those who came before, but the seal has weakened over time. And now, with the blood moon approaching, he will rise again." A chill ran down Emily's spine. "And Amelia Hawthorne? What does she have to do with this?" The man's expression darkened, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Amelia Hawthorne was the last of the old blood, the last descendant of those who sealed the Dark One away. She tried to stop him, but she failed. Her death was the beginning of the end for Black Hollow." Emily's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. "The key," she said, holding it up. "I found this at her tomb. What does it open?" The man's gaze flickered to the key, a shadow of something like fear crossing his face. "That key opens a door that should never be opened," he said quietly. "Amelia's Rest is more than just a place. It is a tomb, a prison, and the only thing standing between this world and the Dark One's return." Emily's grip tightened on the key. "Then I need to find it," she said, determination hardening her voice. "I need to stop him." The man shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. Once the door is opened, there is no going back. The darkness will consume everything. You must leave Black Hollow while you still can." But Emily was no longer listening. Her mind was made up. Whatever it took, she would find Amelia's Rest and put an end to the curse that had claimed Black Hollow. The lives of everyone in the town, maybe even beyond, depended on it. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the church, leaving the man standing in the shadows. As she stepped back onto the street, the cold air hit her like a wall, but she didn't stop. She had a destination now, a purpose, and nothing would deter her. But as she made her way through the silent, deserted town, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The darkness was closing in, and Emily knew that whatever lay ahead, it would test her in ways she could never have imagined. Chapter 4. The Hollow Ones. As Emily ventured deeper into Black Hollow, the sense of unease grew with every step. The narrow streets seemed to twist and turn in on themselves, creating a labyrinth of shadows that threatened to swallow her whole. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional creak of old wood or the distant rustle of leaves, as if the town itself was alive and watching her every move. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the sky above was a mottled gray, the sun barely piercing through the dense cloud cover. The weight of the old key in her pocket was a constant reminder of her mission. But the man's warning echoed in her mind. Once the door is opened, there is no going back. But Emily had made up her mind. Whatever evil lurked in Black Hollow, whatever darkness threatened to consume the town, she would face it head-on. She had no choice. The whispers that had haunted her in the cemetery still lingered at the edges of her consciousness, their words filled with dread and prophecy. The town seemed deserted, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, and she could almost sense eyes watching her from behind the cracked windows and closed doors. The buildings loomed over her, their facades crumbling, their windows dark and empty like the hollow eyes of forgotten ghosts. She passed by what appeared to have once been a general store, its sign faded and hanging by a single rusted chain. The windows were shattered, the shelves inside long empty, covered in dust and cobwebs. A faint chill ran down Emily's spine as she imagined the people who had once lived here, their lives abruptly ended by whatever curse had befallen the town. As she continued down the street, she came across a narrow alleyway, almost hidden between two dilapidated buildings. Something about it caught her attention, a faint, almost imperceptible sound like the whisper of a breeze through the trees. But there was no wind, no movement in the still, heavy air. Curiosity piqued. Emily hesitated for a moment before cautiously stepping into the alley. The walls on either side were covered in ivy and grime, the ground littered with debris. The further she went, the darker it became, until the light from the street was barely a sliver behind her. She hadn't gone far when she noticed something strange, a series of symbols carved into the brick walls. They were small and crude, almost childlike in their simplicity, but there was something unsettling about them. Circles within circles, lines that intersected in jagged angles, and patterns that seemed to twist and shift when she looked at them too long. As she reached out to touch one of the symbols, a sudden movement caught her eye. At the far end of the alley, where the darkness was deepest, a figure emerged from the shadows. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she watched the figure slowly approach. At first, it appeared to be a man, tall and thin, but as it drew closer, she realized something was terribly wrong. The figure's movements were unnatural, jerky, and stiff, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Its face was obscured by a hood, but she could see the faint glow of pale eyes beneath the shadow. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure stopped, its head tilting to one side as if studying her. For a moment, neither of them moved, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, in a voice that was little more than a rasping whisper, the figure spoke. "Why have you come here?" Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'm looking for answers," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to know what happened in this town." The figure's head tilted further, the pale eyes narrowing. "The town is cursed," it said, the words slow and deliberate. "It has been cursed for generations. You should not have come here." "I don't have a choice," Emily said, her resolve hardening. "Something brought me here. Something I need to understand. I found a key, and I think it leads to a place called Amelia's Rest. Do you know what that is?" At the mention of Amelia's Rest, the figure recoiled slightly, a low hiss escaping its lips. "Amelia's Rest is a tomb," it said, the voice now laced with fear. "A tomb for the cursed, for those who sought to challenge the Dark One and failed. To open it is to invite death." Emily's heart raced. "But I have to stop him, whatever he is. The blood moon is coming, and if what I've heard is true, it will bring something terrible." The figure was silent for a long moment, the shadows around it seeming to pulse with a life of their own. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed back the way Emily had come. "Leave," it whispered. "Leave this place and never return. The Dark One cannot be stopped. He has waited too long, and his power grows with each passing day. If you open that tomb, you will release him, and all will be lost." Emily shook her head. "I can't do that. I have to try." The figure lowered its hand, the glow of its eyes dimming. "Tesh, then you are a fool," it said, its voice heavy with resignation. "But I will not stop you. The path you seek lies beyond the church, in the heart of the forest. There you will find Amelia's Rest." Without another word, the figure turned and retreated into the shadows, its form disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Emily stood there for a moment, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on her. A tomb for the cursed. A place where those who had challenged the Dark One had met their end, and now she was about to follow in their footsteps. But there was no turning back now. She had come too far, uncovered too much. Whatever lay ahead, she had to face it. The fate of Black Hollow, and perhaps more, rested on her shoulders. With a deep breath, Emily turned and retraced her steps back to the street. The old stone church loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. Beyond it lay the forest, the heart of the darkness that had claimed the town. As she approached the church, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, following her every move. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive with malevolent intent. She passed by the church, her eyes fixed on the path that led into the forest. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches reaching out like twisted arms, their leaves rustling in the faint breeze. With the key clutched tightly in her hand, Emily stepped into the forest. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker with every step she took. The path was narrow and overgrown, the trees closing in around her, blocking out the last traces of daylight. But she pressed on, driven by a determination she hadn't known she possessed. The further she went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their bark blackened and cracked as if scorched by fire. The ground was littered with dead leaves and broken branches, the scent of decay thick in the air. As she walked, she became aware of a sound, a low, rhythmic chanting, faint at first but growing louder with each step. It seemed to come from all around her, a chorus of voices rising and falling in a haunting melody. The path ahead began to slope downward, the ground becoming uneven and treacherous. The trees thinned out, revealing a clearing up ahead. In the center of the clearing stood a large, ancient-looking mausoleum, its stone walls covered in ivy and moss. The door was sealed shut, but there was no mistaking the name carved into the stone above it, Amelia's Rest. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she approached the mausoleum. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, as if urging her to turn back. But she had come too far to stop now. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the key. It was old and tarnished, the metal cool to the touch. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key into the lock, the sound of metal scraping against stone echoing in the stillness. With a deep breath, Emily turned the key. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark, yawning abyss beyond. For a moment she hesitated, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her. But then she stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside. The air was cold and damp, the scent of earth and decay filling her nostrils. The only light came from the faint glow of her phone, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She took a few tentative steps forward, the floor uneven beneath her feet. The chanting had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on her like a physical weight. And then she saw it, a stone sarcophagus in the center of the chamber, its lid carved with the image of a woman in repose. The name Amelia Hawthorne was etched into the stone, along with a series of symbols that matched those she had seen in the alleyway. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the sarcophagus. The air around it felt thick, almost tangible, as if she was walking through water. The darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows shifting and writhing as if in anticipation. With trembling hands, she reached out and touched the lid of the sarcophagus. The stone was cold and smooth beneath her fingers, the carvings intricate and detailed. She could feel a faint vibration beneath her touch, as if the stone itself was alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a low rumble reverberating through the chamber. The symbols on the sarcophagus began to glow with an eerie light, pulsing in time with the tremors. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing as the lid of the sarcophagus slowly began to slide open. A gust of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far worse. She watched in horror as the lid fell to the ground with a deafening crash, revealing the darkness within. The chanting returned, louder and more insistent than before, the voices echoing off the walls in a cacophony of sound. And then, from the depths of the sarcophagus, a figure began to rise. It was a woman, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Her hair was long and dark, flowing around her like a veil, and her clothes were tattered and stained with blood. Emily backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet refused to move. The woman stepped out of the sarcophagus, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on Emily. "You should not have come here," the woman said, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo in the darkness. "Now you will never leave." With a sudden burst of speed, the woman lunged at Emily, her hands outstretched, her fingers like claws. Emily screamed and turned to run, but the woman was upon her in an instant, her cold hands wrapping around Emily's throat. Emily struggled, gasping for air as the woman's grip tightened, her vision beginning to blur. The chanting grew louder, the voices merging into a single deafening roar, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The woman released her grip, and Emily fell to the ground, gasping for breath. The chamber was silent once more, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. She looked up, her heart still racing, but the woman was gone. The sarcophagus was empty, the symbols on its surface dim and lifeless. Emily lay there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, the events of the past few minutes blending together in a nightmarish haze. But one thing was clear. She was not alone in the tomb. Something had been awakened, something dark and malevolent, and it was coming for her. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily scrambled to her feet and ran to the door, her hands fumbling for the key. She jammed it into the lock and twisted it with all her strength, the door swinging open with a groan of protest. She burst out of the tomb and into the forest, the cold air hitting her like a slap to the face. The path before her was dark and treacherous, but she didn't care. She had to get out, had to escape the horrors she had unleashed. But as she ran, she could hear it, the sound of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, growing closer with every step. The shadows seemed to close in around her, the trees reaching out like twisted hands to pull her back. She didn't dare look back, her heart pounding in her chest as she sprinted down the path, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps grew louder, faster, until they were right behind her, almost upon her. And then, with a final burst of speed, she broke through the trees and into the open, the lights of the town visible in the distance. She didn't stop running until she reached the outskirts of Black Hollow, her legs burning, her lungs on fire. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, her mind reeling from the terror she had just experienced. But even as she lay there, the memory of the woman's glowing eyes and cold touch seared into her mind. She knew that this was only the beginning. The Dark One was awake, and the nightmare was far from over. Chapter 5. The Shadowed Past. Emily stood at the edge of Black Hollow, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The town's dim lights flickered in the distance, a faint beacon of safety that seemed almost unreachable. The night was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the echo of footsteps still haunting her ears. Her mind raced with thoughts of the woman she had seen in the tomb, the cold grip of her hands, and those glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through her soul. Who was she? What had Emily awakened in that cursed place? For a moment, Emily considered running into the town, pounding on the doors of strangers, begging for help. But the thought of trying to explain the horrors she had encountered to the townsfolk, most of whom had warned her against coming here in the first place, filled her with dread. Would they even believe her? And if they did, would they turn on her, blaming her for disturbing the malevolent force that now roamed the night? Summoning the last of her strength, Emily rose to her feet. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move, each step a struggle against the overwhelming urge to collapse. She needed answers, and there was only one place left in Black Hollow where she might find them. Emily's footsteps echoed through the empty streets as she made her way to the far end of town, where the oldest house in Black Hollow stood, a weathered, Victorian-style mansion known as Crow's Nest. The mansion was perched on a hill overlooking the town, its spires silhouetted against the night sky like the talons of a great bird. It had an air of decay about it, as though it had been forgotten by time, its windows dark and lifeless. This was the home of Agnes Crowley, the town's reclusive historian, and the last living descendant of Black Hollow's founding family. The Crawleys were known for their deep knowledge of the town's history and the dark secrets that lay buried within its soil. Agnes, in particular, was said to be the keeper of those secrets, a woman with a mind as sharp as a blade and a tongue that could cut just as deep. As Emily approached the wrought iron gate that guarded the entrance to Crow's Nest, she hesitated. The gate creaked open on its own, as if beckoning her inside. She shivered, feeling the weight of the mansion's gaze upon her, but pressed on, the need for answers driving her forward. The path leading up to the mansion was overgrown with weeds and lined with statues of crows, their stone eyes following her every move. The air was thick, with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of distant laughter. When Emily finally reached the front door, she found it slightly ajar. The wood, swollen and cracked from years of exposure to the elements. She pushed it open with a creak, the sound echoing through the empty hall beyond. Inside, the air was cool and musty, the faint smell of burning sage mingling with the scent of old books and polished wood. The foyer was grand but faded, its once ornate decor now draped in cobwebs and dust. A large, spiraling staircase dominated the room, its banister carved with intricate designs of crows in flight. Above it hung a chandelier that looked as though it hadn't been lit in decades. "Miss Crowley?" Emily called out, her voice trembling slightly. It felt wrong to break the silence of the mansion, as if speaking aloud might wake something that should remain asleep. From the shadows at the top of the staircase, a figure emerged, tall and gaunt, with long silver hair cascading down her back. Agnes Crowley was every bit as intimidating as the stories had suggested. Her face was lined with age, but her blue eyes were bright and piercing, as if they could see right through Emily's soul. "You're late," Agnes said, her voice strong and clear despite her frail appearance. "I expected you hours ago." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "You expected me?" Agnes nodded, descending the stairs with a grace that belied her age. She moved with purpose, her long black dress rustling softly as she approached. "The spirits have been restless tonight. They've been whispering about you, child. You've disturbed something that should have been left alone." "I didn't mean to," Emily began, but Agnes held up a hand to silence her. "No one ever does," Agnes replied, her gaze softening slightly. "But now that it's done, there's no going back. Come, we have much to discuss." Agnes led Emily through the dimly lit halls of the mansion, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking men and women, their eyes following Emily as she passed. It felt as though the entire house was alive, watching her, judging her. Finally, they entered a small, cluttered room filled with books, ancient artifacts, and strange symbols carved into the walls. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Agnes gestured for Emily to sit in one of the worn leather chairs by the fire. "Now," Agnes said, settling into her own chair and fixing Emily with a steady gaze, "tell me everything." Emily recounted her experience in the tomb, her voice barely above a whisper as she described the woman in the sarcophagus, the chanting, and the sense of something dark and powerful being awakened. Agnes listened intently, her expression unreadable, but her eyes flickered with recognition at certain points in the story. When Emily finished, the room was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound breaking the heavy stillness. "You have encountered the Dark One," Agnes said finally, her voice grave. "She is one of the Hollow Ones, the restless spirits that haunt this land. But this one is different, stronger, older, more dangerous." "Who was she?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Her name was Lilith," Agnes replied, her tone tinged with sadness. "She was a powerful sorceress, feared and revered by the people of Black Hollow centuries ago. She practiced the dark arts, delving into forbidden rituals that gave her control over life and death. But her power came at a cost. The town turned on her, and she was executed for her crimes. They buried her in that tomb, sealing it with powerful wards to keep her spirit trapped. But it seems those wards have weakened over time." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. What does she want? "Revenge," Agnes said simply. "Lilith was wronged in life, and now she seeks to punish those who disturbed her rest. She is bound to the land of Black Hollow, and she will not stop until she has claimed what she believes is rightfully hers." Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "But why me? Why did she come after me?" "Because you were the one who awakened her," Agnes replied, her gaze piercing. "You disturbed her tomb, and now she sees you as a threat. But there's more to it than that, child. The spirits of this land are drawn to those who have a connection to the past, those who carry the blood of those who wronged them. Tell me, Emily, do you know anything about your family's history?" Emily shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "No. My parents died when I was young. I was raised by my aunt, but she never talked much about our family." Agnes leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as if deep in thought. "It is possible that your ancestors were involved in Lilith's execution, or perhaps they were connected to the events that led to her downfall. The past has a way of repeating itself, and the sins of the fathers often fall upon the children." Emily's mind reeled with the implications. Could it be true? Could her family's history be the reason she was being targeted by this vengeful spirit? "What can I do?" Emily asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "How do I stop her?" Agnes regarded her with a somber expression. "There may be a way to put Lilith to rest, but it will not be easy. You must return to Amelia's rest and perform a ritual to cleanse the tomb and seal her spirit once more. But be warned, the Dark One will not go quietly. She will fight to the very end. Emily's stomach churned at the thought of returning to that cursed place, but she knew she had no choice. If she didn't stop Lilith, the entire town of Black Hollow could be in danger. Agnes rose from her chair and crossed the room to a small cabinet. She opened it and retrieved a bundle wrapped in cloth, which she handed to Emily. "This is an ancient grimoire," Agnes explained. "It contains the ritual you will need to perform. Study it carefully, for there can be no mistakes. The ritual must be completed under the light of the full moon, which will be tomorrow night. Until then, you must prepare yourself." Emily took the bundle with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the task ahead. She had come to Black Hollow seeking a fresh start, but now she was faced with a battle for her very soul. As Agnes led her back to the front door, Emily couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread and determination. Chapter 6: Echoes of the Past. Emily left Crow's Nest with a sense of urgency pressing on her shoulders. The grimoire clutched tightly to her chest. She made her way through the darkened streets of Black Hollow, her mind reeling with the gravity of the task ahead. The town seemed different now, its shadows deeper, its silence more oppressive. Every rustle of leaves and distant creak felt like a reminder of the danger lurking nearby. As she reached her small rented cabin on the outskirts of town, Emily's thoughts turned to the grimoire. It was an old leather-bound book, its cover embossed with symbols she didn't recognize. She carefully unwrapped it and set it on the small wooden table in the center of the cabin's living room. The room was sparsely furnished but had a cozy warmth, a stark contrast to the chilling task she faced. The grimoire was heavy with age and secrets. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten notes in a language she couldn't decipher. She found a section in the middle of the book dedicated to the ritual she needed to perform. The words were cryptic and difficult to understand, interspersed with illustrations of strange symbols and diagrams. Emily spent hours poring over the book, trying to make sense of the ritual. The instructions were clear but complex, requiring specific ingredients, precise timing, and exact movements. The ritual needed to be performed under the full moon, which was only a few hours away. Her anxiety grew with each page she turned. If she made even the slightest mistake, Lilith's spirit could remain free, or worse, become stronger. Determined to get it right, Emily made a list of the items she needed: a silver dagger, a vial of moonlit water, a bundle of sage, and a circle of protective runes. She knew she could find the silver dagger and sage at the local occult shop, but the other items would be more challenging to acquire. With the grimoire tucked securely in her bag, Emily set out into the town again. The streets were even quieter than before, the only sounds her footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. The shop she needed was a small, nondescript place located on a narrow side street. Its sign, "Mystic Relics," swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, the shop was filled with shelves of oddities, crystal balls, incense, strange talismans, and dusty tomes. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and old parchment. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with piercing green eyes and silver hair, looked up as Emily entered. "Looking for something special?" the shopkeeper asked, her voice like a rustle of leaves. Emily nodded, explaining her needs with as much detail as she felt comfortable revealing. The shopkeeper's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded knowingly and began to gather the items Emily required. The silver dagger was ornate, its hilt engraved with intricate patterns. The sage was bundled in a fragrant, tightly woven bunch. "Be careful with these," the shopkeeper said, handing Emily the items. "Black Hollow holds many secrets, and not all of them are friendly. You may need more than just these to protect yourself." Emily thanked her and hurried back to her cabin. The moon was rising, casting a silvery light over the town. She set up a small table outside, arranging the items as instructed in the grimoire. The vial of moonlit water was the final touch, a bit of water collected under the full moon's glow, which she had managed to gather from the small pond near her cabin. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Emily prepared herself mentally for the ritual. Her heart pounded, and her hands were clammy with sweat. She reviewed the instructions in the grimoire one last time, ensuring she understood every detail. Midnight struck, and Emily felt a surge of adrenaline. The full moon hung high in the sky, its light filtering through the trees and illuminating the clearing where she had set up. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and adding an eerie soundtrack to her preparations. With trembling hands, Emily began to draw the protective runes on the ground with a piece of chalk, forming a circle around the area where she would perform the ritual. Each symbol had to be perfect, the lines clean and precise. She had practiced drawing them several times, but this was the real thing, and her anxiety made her hands unsteady. Once the runes were drawn, she placed the silver dagger and the bundle of sage in the center of the circle, as instructed. She took a deep breath and began the incantation from the grimoire, her voice wavering at first but gaining strength as she recited the ancient words. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen around her. The wind howled louder, and the leaves swirled in a frenzy. Emily could feel a presence, a heavy, oppressive force pressing down on her, as if the very land was resisting the ritual. As she continued the incantation, the moonlight seemed to intensify, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. The protective runes glowed faintly, their light mingling with the moon's silver sheen. Emily's voice grew stronger, more confident, as she reached the climax of the ritual. Just as she reached the final verse of the incantation, a sudden gust of wind blew through the clearing, extinguishing the candles she had lit and causing the protective runes to flicker. Emily's heart raced as she felt a cold, malevolent presence surge around her. The shadows began to twist and writhe, forming into a dark, indistinct shape at the edge of the clearing. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure. It was Lilith, her translucent form illuminated by the moonlight. Her eyes glowed with an intense, fiery light, and her expression was one of rage and determination. "You dare to challenge me?" Lilith's voice echoed through the clearing, a haunting whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You think your petty rituals can contain me?" Emily stood her ground, her fear mingling with a fierce resolve. "I will do whatever it takes to put you back where you belong," she declared, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. Lilith's form flickered and shifted, the shadows around her writhing like living creatures. The protective runes glowed brighter, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. Emily could feel the power of the ritual taking hold, but Lilith was fighting back with a strength that seemed to grow with every passing moment. The air crackled with energy as the two forces clashed, the dark presence of Lilith battling against the protective circle Emily had created. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the wind howled with a fury that threatened to tear apart the clearing. Emily's voice rang out, chanting the final lines of the incantation with all her might. She could feel the strain on her body, the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her, but she pressed on, determined to see the ritual through. With one final, powerful incantation, the protective runes blazed with an intense light. Lilith's form was pushed back, her screams of rage echoing through the night. The darkness around her began to dissipate, the shadows retreating into the forest. Emily fell to her knees, gasping for breath, her strength nearly spent. The clearing was once again bathed in the soft, silvery light of the moon, and the oppressive presence that had hung over her was gone. As she looked up, she saw Lilith's form fading into the darkness, her fiery eyes the last thing to disappear. The air was still once more, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves. Emily had succeeded in repelling Lilith, but she knew this was only a temporary victory. The Dark One was bound for now, but the malevolent force that had been awakened was still a threat. The battle was far from over, and the darkness of Black Hollow still held many secrets yet to be revealed. Chapter 7. Shadows in the Darkness. Emily awoke the next morning to a sense of uneasy calm. The events of the previous night had left her physically drained, her body aching, and her mind heavy with exhaustion. The sun filtered weakly through the cabin's curtains, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the dim light. The ritual had been a desperate measure, and though she had managed to repel Lilith, Emily knew it was not a permanent solution. The Dark One was still out there, and the sense of dread lingered in the air, as if the land itself was holding its breath. With a sense of grim determination, Emily set about her day. She knew she needed to gather more information about Lilith and the history of Black Hollow if she was to stand any chance of truly putting the spirit to rest. She decided to visit the town library, a place she had avoided so far due to its eerie reputation. The Black Hollow Public Library was housed in an old brick building that looked as though it had seen better days. Its windows were tall and arched, their panes dusty and smeared with grime. The entrance was flanked by stone gargoyles, their grotesque faces frozen in eternal scowls. Emily hesitated for a moment before pushing open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the library was a labyrinth of towering bookshelves, each packed with ancient tomes and yellowed manuscripts. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and mildew. The only sound was the soft shuffle of Emily's footsteps on the worn wooden floor. At the front desk, a young librarian with a solemn expression looked up as Emily approached. Her name tag read, "Martha. Can I help you?" Martha asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the silence of the library. "I need information about the history of Black Hollow," Emily said, "specifically about any local legends or supernatural events." Martha's eyes widened slightly. "You might want to speak with Mr. Thornton," she said, pointing to a door marked Archives at the back of the library. "He's our local historian and knows more about the town's dark past than anyone else." Emily thanked her and made her way to the archives. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a flickering overhead light. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty files and ancient documents. A large oak desk dominated the center of the room, behind which sat an elderly man with a graying beard and sharp, inquisitive eyes. "Mr. Thornton?" Emily said hesitantly as she approached the desk. He looked up from his papers, his expression a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Yes, that's me. How can I assist you?" Emily introduced herself and explained her situation, detailing the encounter with Lilith and the ritual she had performed. Mr. Thornton listened attentively, his brow furrowing as she spoke. "You're dealing with something very dangerous," Mr. Thornton said once she had finished. "Lilith is not just any spirit. She's a remnant of a time when dark magic was more prevalent in Black Hollow. To truly understand her, you need to delve into the town's history." He stood and moved to one of the shelves, retrieving a large, leather-bound book. "This is the town's historical record," he said, laying it on the desk. "It contains accounts of the town's founders, significant events, and the legends that have shaped Black Hollow. It may hold some answers." Emily opened the book, the pages crackling as she turned them. The history was detailed and comprehensive, chronicling the founding of Black Hollow and its evolution over the centuries. As she read, she came across references to various supernatural occurrences and dark rituals performed by the early settlers. One entry in particular caught her attention, a detailed account of Lilith's rise to power and her subsequent downfall. According to the historical record, Lilith had been a powerful sorceress who had come to Black Hollow in the early 1700s. She had been welcomed by the town's founders, who were initially intrigued by her knowledge of ancient magic and alchemy. However, it soon became apparent that Lilith's practices were far from benign. She performed dark rituals and made pacts with malevolent entities, gaining control over the spirits of the land. Her influence grew, and she began to exact vengeance on those who opposed her. Fearing her growing power, the townsfolk decided to take action. A secret council was formed to deal with Lilith. They sought the help of other witches and sorcerers, devising a plan to imprison her spirit and prevent her from causing further harm. The plan involved a powerful binding ritual performed in the very tomb where Emily had found her. The ritual required a combination of magic and sacrifice, and it was successful in trapping Lilith's spirit. However, the binding was not perfect. Over the years, the wards keeping Lilith contained had weakened, and her spirit had begun to stir once more. The accounts in the historical records suggested that Lilith's influence could still be felt in the town, manifesting as unexplained phenomena and supernatural occurrences. Emily's heart raced as she read about the binding ritual and the sacrifices made to contain Lilith. The complexity of the ritual matched what she had seen in the grimoire, but the historical record also hinted at additional elements that might be necessary to ensure the Dark One's permanent confinement. As Emily continued her research, she found a reference to an old hidden journal belonging to one of the original council members. The journal was said to contain detailed notes on the ritual and the wards used to trap Lilith. According to the records, the journal was hidden away in a secret location known only to a few individuals who had sworn to protect the town's secrets. Mr. Thornton explained that the journal was rumored to be buried in a hidden crypt beneath the old church, a place that had been abandoned for decades. The church, once a central part of the community, had fallen into disrepair and was now little more than a crumbling ruin. Emily knew she had to find the journal if she wanted to strengthen the ritual and ensure Lilith's permanent confinement. With a sense of purpose, she thanked Mr. Thornton and left the library, her mind focused on the task ahead. The old church was located on the outskirts of Black Hollow, its once majestic spire, now a crumbling ruin against the backdrop of the forest. The church had long been abandoned, its stained glass windows shattered and its doors hanging loosely on their hinges. Emily approached the church cautiously, the sense of foreboding growing stronger with each step. The wind howled through the empty bell tower, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. She found the entrance partially blocked by debris, but managed to squeeze through. Inside the church was a cavernous space filled with dust and cobwebs. The wooden pews were rotting, and the once grand altar was now a shadow of its former self. Emily's flashlight illuminated the dark corners, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. She searched the church meticulously, using the historical record's descriptions to guide her. After what felt like hours, she discovered a hidden trapdoor beneath the altar. The trapdoor was old and rusty, but she managed to pry it open with a crowbar she had brought along. Below the trapdoor was a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. Emily descended cautiously, her flashlight flickering as she made her way into the hidden crypt. The air was cool and stale, and the walls were lined with ancient, dust-covered relics. At the far end of the crypt, she found a small stone sarcophagus. The sarcophagus was engraved with symbols that matched those in the historical record. Emily's heart raced as she opened it, revealing a hidden compartment containing an old leather-bound journal. Pages filled with handwritten no. Emily carefully extracted the journal from the compartment and examined it. The journal was worn but intact, its pages filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. It was clear from the notes that the journal's author had been deeply involved in the binding ritual. The journal provided detailed instructions on how to strengthen the wards and perform additional rituals to ensure Lilith's confinement. It also included description of various protective spells and enchantments that could be used to shield the town from Lilith's influence. As Emily read through the journal, she realized that the ritual she had performed the previous night was only the beginning. The additional steps outlined in the journal were complex and required precise timing and preparation. She knew she would need to gather more supplies and carefully prepare for the next ritual. The stakes were high, and the danger was far from over. Lilith's spirit was still a threat, and Emily needed to act quickly to prevent her from causing further harm. With the journal in hand, Emily made her way back to the cabin, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. The journey ahead would be arduous and dangerous, but she was determined to see it through. The future of Black Hollow depended on her success, and she was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 8: The Gathering Storm. Emily awoke with the first light of dawn filtering through the cabin's thin curtains. The night had been restless, filled with unsettling dreams and flashes of Lilith's haunting visage. The hidden journal lay beside her on the small wooden table, its worn cover reflecting the early morning light. After a quick breakfast, she sat down at the table, flipping through the journal once more. The detailed instructions for the ritual were daunting, but she had little choice but to proceed. The pages were filled with complex symbols, incantations, and descriptions of magical components. Emily knew that the success of the next ritual was crucial, and every detail had to be meticulously followed. The instructions called for several rare ingredients, including nightshade, moonstone dust, and a vial of essence from a sacred spring. The nightshade was a common ingredient in dark magic, but moonstone dust and the sacred spring essence would be more challenging to find. Emily made a list of these items and planned her next steps carefully. The Black Hollow Apothecary was a small shop tucked away on a side street, its sign creaking in the breeze. Emily approached it with a sense of urgency, the list of ingredients clutched tightly in her hand. The shop's interior was dimly lit, with shelves crammed full of jars containing dried herbs, exotic spices, and mysterious powders. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and herbs. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted Emily with a nod. Her name was Agnes, and she had a reputation for knowing just about everything that could be found in the town's occult circles. "I need nightshade and moonstone dust," Emily said, presenting her list. "Do you have them in stock?" Agnes raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking to the list. "Moonstone dust, you say? That's rare and expensive," she said, her tone cautious. "It's not often someone needs it for something serious. What's it for?" Emily hesitated, but decided to be honest. "I'm performing a ritual to contain a powerful spirit. It's vital that I get these ingredients right." Agnes' expression softened slightly. "Very well, I have moonstone dust, but it's not cheap. And nightshade, you'll find that in the back." She moved to the shelves and retrieved a small jar filled with shimmering dust. "This should be enough." Emily paid for the items and thanked Agnes before heading out. She could feel a growing sense of urgency. Each ingredient she acquired brought her closer to the completion of the ritual, but also closer to the danger that awaited. The next item on her list was the essence from a sacred spring. According to the journal, the spring was located deep in the forest, hidden away from the prying eyes of the townsfolk. Emily had heard of the spring before, but had never visited it. Armed with a map from the historical record and a sense of determination, she set out for the forest. The sun was high in the sky, filtering through the canopy of trees and casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was cool and filled with the scent of pine and earth. Emily followed the map's directions, navigating through the dense underbrush and overgrown trails. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds. The deeper she went, the more she felt the oppressive weight of the forest, as if it was watching her every move. After hours of hiking, she arrived at the sacred spring. It was a beautiful, serene place, with crystal-clear water bubbling up from a natural stone basin. The area was surrounded by ancient trees, their branches arching overhead to form a protective canopy. Emily carefully filled a vial with the spring's essence, feeling a sense of reverence as she did so. The water seemed to shimmer with a faint, ethereal light. Back at the cabin, Emily laid out all the ingredients on the table, inspecting them with a critical eye. The moonstone dust glistened in the light, and the nightshade was a deep, rich green. The vial of spring essence was the last component she needed. The ritual was set to take place under the next full moon, which was only a few days away. Emily knew she had to prepare thoroughly to ensure everything went smoothly. She reviewed the journal's instructions once more, noting the specific timing and sequence of the ritual. She set up a makeshift altar in the clearing near her cabin, arranging the ingredients according to the ritual's requirements. She spent hours preparing the area, drawing protective symbols on the ground, and setting up candles in a circle around the altar. As the full moon approached, Emily felt a growing sense of dread. The previous night's encounter with Lilith had left her shaken, and she knew that the next ritual would be even more dangerous. She had to be vigilant and precise, or the consequences could be dire. On the eve of the ritual, Emily decided to take a short walk to clear her mind and alleviate some of the mounting tension. The moon was already waxing, casting a silvery glow over the town. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She took a different route through the forest, hoping to distract herself. It was then that she encountered a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was cloaked in dark robes, their face obscured by a hood. Emily stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, revealing a face that was both familiar and unsettling. It was Martha, the librarian from the town library. Her eyes were wide and filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "I've been following you," Martha said, her voice barely audible. "I needed to warn you. There are things happening in Black Hollow that go beyond what you know." Emily's confusion grew. "And what do you mean? I'm already aware of the danger." Martha looked around nervously before speaking. "Lilith's influence is growing stronger. There are forces at work that even the historical record didn't fully reveal. The town's past is entwined with dark secrets, and there are people who want to see Lilith unleashed. You're not alone in this, but you must be careful." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you suggest?" Martha hesitated before handing Emily a small, intricately carved box. "This contains a protective charm. It's been passed down through generations. It might help you during the ritual." Emily took the box, her hands trembling. "Thank you. I'll be careful." Martha nodded and melted back into the shadows, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. The encounter had added another layer of complexity to her already daunting task. As she returned to her cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was gathering, and the true challenge lay ahead. Chapter 8. The Gathering Storm. Emily awoke with the first light of dawn filtering through the cabin's thin curtains. The night had been restless, filled with unsettling dreams and flashes of Lilith's haunting visage. The hidden journal lay beside her on the small wooden table, its worn cover reflecting the early morning light. After a quick breakfast, she sat down at the table, flipping through the journal once more. The detailed instructions for the ritual were daunting, but she had little choice but to proceed. The pages were filled with complex symbols, incantations, and descriptions of magical components. Emily knew that the success of the next ritual was crucial, and every detail had to be meticulously followed. The instructions called for several rare ingredients, including nightshade, moonstone dust, and a vial of essence from a sacred spring. The nightshade was a common ingredient in dark magic, but moonstone dust and the sacred spring essence would be more challenging to find. Emily made a list of these items and planned her next steps carefully. The Black Hollow Apothecary was a small shop tucked away on a side street, its sign creaking in the breeze. Emily approached it with a sense of urgency, the list of ingredients clutched tightly in her hand. The shop's interior was dimly lit, with shelves crammed full of jars containing dried herbs, exotic spices, and mysterious powders. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and herbs. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted Emily with a nod. Her name was Agnes, and she had a reputation for knowing just about everything that could be found in the town's occult circles. "I need nightshade and moonstone dust," Emily said, presenting her list. "Do you have them in stock?" Agnes raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking to the list. "Moonstone dust, you say? That's rare and expensive," she said, her tone cautious. "It's not often someone needs it for something serious. What's it for?" Emily hesitated, but decided to be honest. "I'm performing a ritual to contain a powerful spirit. It's vital that I get these ingredients right." Agnes' expression softened slightly. "Very well, I have moonstone dust, but it's not cheap. And nightshade, you'll find that in the back." She moved to the shelves and retrieved a small jar filled with shimmering dust. "This should be enough." Emily paid for the items and thanked Agnes before heading out. She could feel a growing sense of urgency. Each ingredient she acquired brought her closer to the completion of the ritual, but also closer to the danger that awaited. The next item on her list was the essence from a sacred spring. According to the journal, the spring was located deep in the forest, hidden away from the prying eyes of the townsfolk. Emily had heard of the spring before, but had never visited it. Armed with a map from the historical record and a sense of determination, she set out for the forest. The sun was high in the sky, filtering through the canopy of trees and casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was cool and filled with the scent of pine and earth. Emily followed the map's directions, navigating through the dense underbrush and overgrown trails. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds. The deeper she went, the more she felt the oppressive weight of the forest, as if it was watching her every move. After hours of hiking, she arrived at the sacred spring. It was a beautiful, serene place, with crystal clear water bubbling up from a natural stone basin. The area was surrounded by ancient trees, their branches arching overhead to form a protective canopy. Emily carefully filled a vial with the spring's essence, feeling a sense of reverence as she did so. The water seemed to shimmer with a faint, ethereal light. Back at the cabin, Emily laid out all the ingredients on the table, inspecting them with a critical eye. The moonstone dust glistened in the light, and the nightshade was a deep, rich green. The vial of spring essence was the last component she needed. The ritual was set to take place under the next full moon, which was only a few days away. Emily knew she had to prepare thoroughly to ensure everything went smoothly. She reviewed the journal's instructions once more, noting the specific timing and sequence of the ritual. She set up a makeshift altar in the clearing near her cabin, arranging the ingredients according to the ritual's requirements. She spent hours preparing the area, drawing protective symbols on the ground, and setting up candles in a circle around the altar. As the full moon approached, Emily felt a growing sense of dread. The previous night's encounter with Lilith had left her shaken, and she knew that the next ritual would be even more dangerous. She had to be vigilant and precise, or the consequences could be dire. On the eve of the ritual, Emily decided to take a short walk to clear her mind and alleviate some of the mounting tension. The moon was already waxing, casting a silvery glow over the town. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She took a different route through the forest, hoping to distract herself. It was then that she encountered a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was cloaked in dark robes, their face obscured by a hood. Emily stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, revealing a face that was both familiar and unsettling. It was Martha, the librarian from the town library. Her eyes were wide and filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "I've been following you," Martha said, her voice barely audible. "I needed to warn you. There are things happening in Black Hollow that go beyond what you know." Emily's confusion grew. "And what do you mean? I'm already aware of the danger." Martha looked around nervously before speaking. "Lilith's influence is growing stronger. There are forces at work that even the historical record didn't fully reveal. The town's past is entwined with dark secrets, and there are people who want to see Lilith unleashed. You're not alone in this, but you must be careful." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you suggest?" Martha hesitated before handing Emily a small, intricately carved box. "This contains a protective charm. It's been passed down through generations. It might help you during the ritual." Emily took the box, her hands trembling. "Thank you. I'll be careful." Martha nodded and melted back into the shadows, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. The encounter had added another layer of complexity to her already daunting task. As she returned to her cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was gathering, and the true challenge lay ahead. Chapter 9. The Night of the Full Moon. The days leading up to the full moon were a blur of preparation for Emily. She meticulously followed every detail in the journal, ensuring that her preparations were flawless. The cabin had become a makeshift sanctuary of sorts, with protective symbols drawn on the floor and candles arranged in precise patterns. She had also set up a small altar in the clearing near the cabin, where the ritual would take place. The night of the full moon arrived with an eerie stillness. The forest was bathed in silver light, and the air was filled with the subtle hum of nocturnal creatures. Emily felt a mix of anticipation and dread as she prepared for the ritual. The protective charm from Martha was safely tucked away in her pocket, a comforting presence against the unknown dangers she would face. Emily dressed in dark ceremonial robes she had found in the cabin's attic, which seemed fitting for the occasion. She wore a silver pendant around her neck, a gift from her grandmother, which she believed would provide an extra layer of protection. With the moon high in the sky, she walked to the clearing, where her altar awaited. The candles flickered in the gentle breeze, casting dancing shadows that seemed to come alive in the moonlight. The altar was adorned with the ritual ingredients: nightshade, moonstone, dust, and the vial of sacred spring essence. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. She began by lighting the candles in a specific sequence as outlined in the journal. The flames cast an otherworldly glow around the clearing, creating an atmosphere of mystical anticipation. She carefully arranged the nightshade and moonstone dust on the altar, following the journal's instructions. The essence from the sacred spring was the final touch, and she poured it into a small basin at the center of the altar. The liquid shimmered, reflecting the moonlight in a dazzling display. With everything in place, Emily began the ritual. She recited the incantations from the journal, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. The words felt powerful as they left her lips, resonating with the ancient magic that had bound Lilith in the past. As she continued, the air around her grew colder, and the shadows in the forest seemed to stretch and warp. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and causing the candles to flicker violently. Emily's heart raced, but she pressed on, determined to complete the ritual. The protective charm from Martha pulsed with a soft, reassuring light. Emily could feel its warmth, providing a semblance of comfort amidst the growing tension. The ritual reached its climax as she performed a series of complex gestures, combining the nightshade and moonstone dust in a final, intricate pattern. Just as Emily neared the end of the ritual, a sudden, bone-chilling silence fell over the clearing. The wind ceased, and the shadows seemed to congeal into a dense, oppressive fog. Emily's breath quickened as she felt a malevolent presence looming nearby. The fog thickened, obscuring the clearing and making it difficult to see. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the trees, sending shivers down Emily's spine. She knew that Lilith was near, and the spirit's presence was more palpable than ever. Suddenly, the fog parted, and Lilith appeared before Emily. The spirit was a terrifying vision, her form flickering between solid and ethereal. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and her voice was a chilling whisper that seemed to echo from all directions. "You think you can contain me with your petty rituals?" Lilith's voice was filled with contempt. "I am bound by chains, but not defeated. I will break free, and when I do, this world will know true suffering." Emily's heart pounded as she faced the spirit. She knew that the ritual was not yet complete, and that Lilith's threat was very real. Desperately, she continued with the final incantations, trying to strengthen the wards and complete the binding process. Just as Lilith seemed on the verge of overpowering the ritual, a sudden flash of light illuminated the clearing. Martha emerged from the forest, her hands glowing with a powerful protective aura. She chanted in a language that Emily did not recognize, her voice commanding and resolute. The light from Martha's spell pushed back the fog, and Lilith's form wavered as if struggling against an invisible force. Emily could see the spirit's anger and frustration as Martha's magic countered Lilith's dark presence. With Martha's help, Emily was able to complete the final stages of the ritual. The protective charm she had been given glowed brightly, adding its power to the spell. The air around them grew warmer, and the oppressive fog began to dissipate. Lilith let out a final piercing scream as the words intensified, her form disintegrating into a swirl of dark mist. The ground shook and the candles flared brightly before finally extinguishing, leaving the clearing in a tense silence. As the fog cleared, Emily and Martha stood amidst the remnants of the ritual. The clearing was still and quiet, the eerie feeling that had permeated the night beginning to lift. Emily felt a profound sense of relief, but also exhaustion. The ritual had been a grueling test, and Lilith's near escape was a stark reminder of the danger that still lurked. Martha approached Emily, her face reflecting both concern and relief. "You did well," she said softly, "but this battle is far from over. Lilith's influence may be diminished, but there are still dark forces at work in Black Hollow." Emily nodded, her thoughts racing. "Thank you for your help. I couldn't have done it without you." Martha smiled faintly. "We're not finished yet. There's more to uncover about Lilith and the town's dark history. The secrets are deeper than you realize, and we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." As they walked back to the cabin, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger struggle. The night had been a victory, but it had also opened her eyes to the many challenges still ahead. The full moon's light had revealed both the strength and the fragility of their fight against the darkness. Emily knew that she and Martha would have to work together to uncover the remaining secrets and confront the dark forces threatening Black Hollow. The battle against Lilith was not over, and the true test of their resolve was yet to come. Chapter 10. The Unseen Forces. The clearing was still in the aftermath of the ritual. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the landscape as Emily and Martha made their way back to the cabin. The forest seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath after the intense confrontation with Lilith. Emily's thoughts raced as she walked beside Martha. The ritual had been a desperate attempt to contain the spirit, but Lilith's chilling threats lingered in her mind. The dark forces at play were more powerful than she had anticipated, and the sense of impending danger was far from over. Back at the cabin, Emily and Martha entered to find the interior in disarray. The candles had been knocked over during their absence, and a chill had settled in the room. The protective symbols on the floor were slightly smudged, a sign that the ritual's power had been tested. Martha immediately went to work, restoring the protective symbols and lighting fresh candles. Emily, still shaken from the night's events, sat down at the table and examined the journal. The pages seemed to hold even more secrets, and she felt a growing urgency to understand them. As Emily and Martha worked, they discussed the events of the night. Martha revealed that Lilith's power was tied to more than just the ritual. It was linked to ancient forces that had been awakened by the town's history. "There's a legend," Martha began, her voice low and contemplative, "about a pact made long ago between the town's founders and a dark entity. The pact was meant to secure prosperity, but it came with a terrible price. The entity was bound by powerful magic, but its influence remained, lurking in the shadows." Emily's eyes widened as she absorbed this information. "So Lilith is part of this pact? How do we break it?" Martha nodded. "Breaking the pact won't be easy. It requires understanding the full extent of the dark entity's influence and finding a way to reverse the original spell. We need to dig deeper into the town's history and uncover the truth behind the pact." Emily looked at the journal, realizing that the answers they sought might be hidden within its pages. "I need to find out more about this pact and how it was originally formed. The journal might hold the key." The following day, Emily and Martha set out to explore Black Hollow's historical records. They visited the local library, which held archives and documents dating back to the town's founding. The library was a grand building filled with old books, dusty files, and ancient manuscripts. As they delved into the records, Emily found herself poring over documents that described the town's early settlers and their dealings with supernatural forces. The records were fragmented and difficult to decipher, but Martha's knowledge of the town's history proved invaluable. Among the documents, Emily discovered a series of old letters and journal entries that hinted at the dark pact made with the entity. The letters were written by one of the town's founders, describing the desperation and fear that drove them to seek the entity's power. It seems that the founders were struggling with a series of misfortunes and threats. Martha explained as she read through one of the letters. They made a deal with a powerful entity, trading their souls and the souls of future generations for prosperity and protection. Emily's heart sank as she read the disturbing details. So Lilith is a manifestation of this entity's power, and breaking the pact will involve more than just a single ritual. Martha nodded gravely. "Yes, we need to find out how the entity was originally bound and whether there are any remaining rituals or artifacts that can help us." As they left the library, Emily and Martha encountered a local historian named Harold. He was an elderly man with a weathered face and an air of quiet authority. Harold had a reputation for knowing every detail of Black Hollow's past. Emily decided to approach him for more information. "Mr. Harold, we're researching the town's early history and came across references to a dark pact made by the founders. Do you know anything about this?" Harold's expression grew serious as he listened. "Ah, the old pact," he said slowly. "It's a part of the town's history that people prefer to forget. There were rumors of a dark entity and a deal made in desperation. The pact was said to be sealed with ancient magic, but details are scarce." Emily and Martha pressed him for more information, but Harold's knowledge seemed limited. However, he did mention an old abandoned chapel on the outskirts of town. The chapel was used for various rituals long ago. It's possible that some records or artifacts might still be there. Emily felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Mr. Harold. We'll check it out. Later that day, Emily and Martha made their way to the abandoned chapel. It was a dilapidated structure, overgrown with vines and shrouded in an air of neglect. The chapel's wooden doors creaked as they pushed them open, revealing a dusty interior filled with cobwebs and decaying pews. They explored the chapel, searching for anything that might provide clues about the Dark Pact. The walls were lined with faded murals and inscriptions, some of which depicted scenes of ancient rituals and supernatural beings. In a hidden alcove behind the altar, Emily found an old chest covered in dust. She carefully opened it to reveal a collection of old manuscripts, ritual tools, and faded parchment. One of the manuscripts was marked with strange symbols that resembled those in the journal. Martha examined the manuscripts closely. These might be records of the original rituals and the binding spell. We need to study them carefully. Emily nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment. This could be the breakthrough we've been looking for. With this information, we might be able to find out to break the pact and finally put an end to Lilith's influence. Back at the cabin, Emily and Martha reviewed the manuscripts and the journal. The new information provided crucial insights into the binding spell and the dark entity's influence. They worked late into the night, decoding the symbols and planning their next moves. Emily felt a renewed sense of determination. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but there was still much work to be done. The ritual they had performed was only one step in a much larger battle. As they prepared for the next phase of their investigation, Emily knew that the path ahead would be challenging. The dark forces at play were formidable, and breaking the ancient pact would require all their strength and knowledge. But with Martha's help and the new clues they had uncovered, Emily felt hopeful. The fight against Lilith and the dark entity was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever lay ahead.